Controlling light with flash, week 9. There are several different kinds of flash photography, the most common type being an on-camera flash, which is what we'll be covering during this session. Ironically, the best flash photo is often one where you can't tell that the flash was used at all. It's used in such a way that it complements other light around it. You'll find out during the session that setting exposure is quite different from the way that we've set exposure with our previous images with the f-stop and the shutter speed. This is because your subject will be lit by two very different light sources. The flash, which is something that you will have control over, and the ambient light, which could be daylight, it could be the room light, but it is likely to be beyond your control. This diagram represents what happens when the flash fires on the top of the camera. The first green line represents the point at which the shutter opens, referred to as the first curtain, and the second green line is the point at which the shutter closes, the second curtain. The blue line shows the point at which the camera flash pulses. You'll see that the actual pulse of the camera flash is only a fraction of the actual full length of the exposure. The ambient light is represented by a red line, and you'll see that runs for the whole length of the exposure and is consistent all the way through. The key to understanding exposure with flash photography is to remember that the shutter speed won't affect the amount of light that gets captured from your flash. This is because the flash pulse is only a fraction of the actual length of your shutter speed. What the shutter speed will control is the ambient light and how much of the ambient light you let into your camera. These two things together are referred to as the flash ratio. So flash ratio, that is the mix between the ambient light and the light from the flash. And the weighting of light, or the weighting of flash or ambient light, is described as a ratio. So the diagrams shown in this slide show a flash ratio of 0, which is basically only ambient light lighting our subject. The next picture shows a mixture of ambient light and flash, but the ambient light is predominant. So you get a flash ratio of anywhere between 1:8 and 1:2. This is commonly referred to as fill flash. The next flash ratio is 1:1, which is a balance between ambient light and flash. The last ratio shown is strong flash, which is where the flash ratio is 2:1 to 8:1. This is where the flash will be stronger than the ambient light. When you have lighting conditions such as very bright daylight, so only ambient light, or very bright flash and very little ambient light, you will get a very contrasty shot. Now, contrast describes the brightness difference between the lightest and the darkest point of the subject. The amount of contrast will depend on the distribution of the light source. Now, concentrated or hard light will produce a high contrast shot with heavy shadows. Softer light, which has been diffused or scattered, will produce less shadow. So for example, the clouds will produce soft light because they will diffuse the sunlight. Contrast is particularly relevant in archaeology when doing site photography. A bright sunny day is a hard light source and produces undesirable heavy shadows. It's very difficult to photograph a trench with a particular feature in it if the sun is casting a very heavy shadow across the feature that you want to record. Archaeologists much prefer an overcast, cloudy day where they get very little shadow in their images. In flash photography generally, as well as with archaeology, soft light is generally more attractive. And a good flash photographer will know how to make their flash appear a lot softer. There are two major ways of doing this. It's by diffusing the light. So with a camera flash, you can put a piece of translucent plastic over the flash, and this will scatter the outgoing light, making it softer. The other way of doing that is bouncing a flash. Lots of on-camera flashes will twist around on the top of the camera, so you can turn the flash away from the subject and bounce it off a reflector, off a ceiling, off a wall. So the light from your flash originates from a greater area and so appears softer. You need to remember though, when bouncing a flash, it greatly reduces the intensity. So you'll have to have a stronger flash or a longer exposure to get the same image. A flash ratio of 1:2 is referred to as fill flash. Fill flash means that the flash is contributing less to the exposure than the ambient light. What the fill flash is effectively doing is filling in the shadows of your subject. It is a common misconception that flash is only used for situations where it's dark. Fill flash is very useful under bright ambient light where your subject may be backlit. You may be taking a shot of a person where the light is coming from the back and you find that their face is in shadow. Very useful to use fill flash in this situation to try to balance up the ambient light and the lighting on the subject's face. Fill flash is particularly useful in site photography, as we were talking about trenches with very heavy shadows cast across them. It's not always possible to wait for an overcast day. If you have to take photographs in sunny conditions, then fill flash is very useful to eradicate some of the heavy shadows caused by the bright sunny lighting conditions. You may remember on one of the earlier slides we talked about first and second curtain sinks. This was when the shutter opened, which was the first curtain, and the shutter closed, which was the second curtain. Now this becomes significant with flash photography because if you're taking a moving object, it affects how the subject's motion blur is perceived. A photo of a moving object, when taken with a flash, is comprised of both a blurred portion, which is exposed by the ambient light, and a sharper portion, which is exposed by the flash. Each of these are effectively overlaid on the image, and you get an image like the one shown here, which gives the impression of a bus moving very fast through the image. Now we can go back to that earlier diagram, and it's been slightly modified. What we can do with our cameras is control whether the camera flash pulse happens just after the shutter opens, i.e. at the first curtain, or just before the shutter closes, i.e. at the second curtain. Now this controls where the blurred portion of the image lies, whether it's in front of the image or whether it trails behind the image. That will become clearer in the next slide. With first curtain sync, i.e. the flash firing just after the shutter has opened, most of the ambient light is captured after the flash. So this causes the blurred portion to streak in front of the sharper flash image. So we have a look at the top train in this image. It gives the impression that the train is moving backwards. Now the bottom train is taken with second curtain sync. So the ambient light is captured and then the flash portion is captured, which gives a much more desirable impression because you want a moving object to look like it's going in the direction that it is actually going. That concludes the theory part of the PowerPoint. Now we've got a short test. The next slide will show a question. Pause the PowerPoint to give yourself some thinking time and then answer the question. The slide following that will give you the answer. There are 6 questions to answer and it's entirely up to you how honestly you do the test, but it might be a useful exercise to glean how much you've actually taken in from the film and decide whether you need to watch it again. What 2 light sources light your subject matter in flash photography? Flash and ambient light. What are the range of flash ratios for fill flash? One to 8 to 1 to 2. What type of image will hard light produce? A high contrast image. Name 2 ways to soften the light from a flash. Use a flash diffuser, bounce the flash. What is a useful technique when using flash to reduce heavy shadows when doing site photography? Fill flash. When using first curtain sync when shooting a moving object, where will the blurred portion of the image appear in relation to the sharper flash portion of the image? In front of it.